Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 36 of my Figure Gaming video series. In this video I'll be covering how to build up a Österreichische Army, or Austrian army, which can be used for as many sets of rules as possible. The largest issue when trying to create a force mix for the first time is the rules and scale. When starting out, you often are unsure what set of rules you'll be using. This is especially an issue with scale, or figure scale. This can range from a figure representing 50 men to 250 men or more. Even when you build a force mix for a specific known set of rules, you may wish to try different rules, either immediately or later. So how can you build up a force mix which can be used for the widest range of figure scales possible? One possible simple solution is, let's say you build up a force mix using a figure scale of 50 men per figure, which means you're building up a corps, basically WRG. Rules such as WRG provide you with army lists that allow you to create a corps-sized formation, and I find these army lists are a reasonable guide for what to purchase. Not perfect, but reasonable. If you move to a scale of 150 men per figure, then each unit, which was previously a battalion, now becomes a regiment. Or to put it another way, your single corps now becomes 3 corps, with all your existing elements divided by 3, each third representing a single corps. If you then decide to move from a figure scale of your original 1 to 50 to, let's say, 1 to 250 or 250 men per figure, this simply means you now field 5 corps, but each corps consists of much less figures, obviously. If you move to a scale of this 250 men per figure, then each unit now becomes a brigade or division. Your elements are now divided by 5, with each fifth representing a single corps. It gets harder to move up the scale ladder any further. With some manual management it's possible, but possibly at this scale there's no need to move any further up from here. If we use the WRG Austrian Army or Österreichische Army list as an example, you can field 12 to 24 battalions, with each regiment consisting of 4 elements or 4 figures each. This is a total of 48 to 96 elements. If you scale this from 1 to 50 to 1 to 50, this now becomes 10 to 18 elements, depending on rounding, because we divide our element total by 5. If we field 4 to 5 corps, we end up with about 48 to 96 elements. In most cases, they are the same elements we started with, requiring no purchase of new elements. However, there are some exceptions. You could also conceivably do the reverse process. If we start with a DBM army list, each infantry element represents 2,400 men. If we scale down to 1,200 men per element, or 300 men per figure, the number of elements are now doubled. If we go down to a WRG scale of 50 men per figure, or 200 men per element, we multiply each of our original elements by 12. You do end up with a very coarse grade army list. So while this may work when we go down to a figure scale of between 300 and 150 per men per figure, at 50 men per figure we lose an enormous amount of detail. At DBN scale it's pretty hard to have a rocket artillery battery, for example. Let's look at these WRG army lists in more detail, starting with the infantry section in our Austrian army list. The army lists are surprisingly detailed, but difficult to understand sometimes. The interesting point is up to 24 battalions of 4 elements could, in theory, be deployed. This makes for a rather large force mix, which would result in a rather long game. On the other hand, this probably would require a lot of raw troops, so they may not stick around for particularly long. I suspect these army lists really are aiming for army sizes which are probably larger than optimal. One point I did find interesting was how few cavalry are deployed, with 3 cavalry regiments allowed. Even if you only use large 24-figure units, this is not a lot of cavalry. The lesson here is you'll not be using much cavalry. It'll be mainly infantry. I wish I'd understood this when I built up my Prussian army. I purchased so many lancers, I will never use them, yet my Landwehr is constantly being used and there's simply not enough of them. The artillery is a rather complex subject in WRG. I personally feel it's unnecessarily complex. and I'm not sure why they went down that path, but putting that to one side, if you read them carefully, it will eventually become clear. The interesting point is the addition of rocket troops, which were deployed in 1812 and not available earlier. This comes up with key issues, or a key issue with this army list. They span the entire Napoleonic War from at least 1800 or perhaps even 1805 to 1815. Players will need to understand rockets were not available in 1809, and Freikorps were not used in the latter period of the war to a large extent, and certainly weren't around in 1805, for example. One possible minor issue is the way the artillery is described: light, medium, heavy, etc. The Austrian foot artillery is described as light-medium, which means they're historically 6-pounders. The Austrians did field 12-pounders, and these are classed as heavy. If players are going to use this for other rules, they may need to replace this nomenclature with the actual artillery being used, which in this case should be 6-pounder and 12-pounders. Otherwise, some minor confusion may arise. The interesting point that I looked at here was the levy status of the horse artillery, which I expect is used to reflect the civilian operators of such guns, or perhaps they are considered as lower quality than a French horse artillery battery, which could also be true. The Austrians, as I indicated earlier, were never really that much into horse artillery for reasons I don't fully understand. Regardless, players will need to be aware of this when converting these army lists into another set of rules. Taking the values I found in the WRG Army list, I inserted them into my Army list spreadsheet, which allowed me to display the army in any figure scale I wish. In this case, I'm using one figure being equal to 250 men. What you see here is the result, with each corps representing a number of elements, 1/5 that of a WRG Army list. In this case, I inserted a limit of 3 corps, which is the 3 against the infantry, cavalry and artillery section. I do this because at this scale I use a playing area 90 centimetres by 60 centimetres deep, and I prefer force mixes of 36 to 42 figures per side. But if you have a larger playing area, you would deploy the full 5 corps, or any number you wish. At this scale you may consider army level units such as heavy artillery, but this is really not required, and at least at this point, I chose not to do so. Drilling into the army lists, or the army lists I've created with my spreadsheet in more detail, we can look at the infantry, where we can deploy 10 to 19 infantry elements per corps. I normally prefer 10 infantry elements, as I also wish to deploy 2 cavalry, 2 artillery, giving me a total of 14 elements, not including the commander. You can multiply this as you wish, based on the size of the playing area. For completeness, this shows the cavalry and artillery. 2 elements of cavalry and 2 of artillery is possibly a good choice. If you went for a maximum of 4 cavalry and 2 infantry with a minimum of 10 infantry, your corps is 16 elements in size. This is cavalry heavy, and I prefer 2 cavalry maximum. Once again, you can see how little cavalry is present when we basically use an army list. You can also go the other way. This is an example of the 3 army lists provided for the Austrians in DBN. While using this for a set of rules using a 1 to 250 or 250 men per figure scale is possible, it's not going to work well for a set of rules using a 50 men per figure. At least I don't think it will. The one point about this is the way the Austrians are divided into 3 periods. I would divide it personally into 4 periods, splitting 1809 from 1812. There's not much difference, but there is some minimal difference. Rockets in 1812 being the most obvious. Infantry mix changed between 1800 and 1815, with 1800 containing more trained line infantry, and in 1815 continuing with a high proportion of Landwehr and lower quality line infantry. Cavalry density also changed, with cavalry numbers decreasing between 1800 and 1815. Mainly because infantry numbers grew so much. The lack of battalion guns in 1812 is another simple example of a change. Using the DBM army lists and other army lists as well to modify, here's a possible breakdown of the Austrian army by period. If using the WRG army list, players may need to fine-tune it based on the period they wish to cover. While not as much of an issue as with, let's say, micro armour, World War II, Cold War, it's best to match force periods to give you a better feeling for the problems the real commanders faced during that particular period that you're dealing with. Of course, if you're recreating a historical conflict, then just use the historical army list and guess the quality of the troop types accordingly. You'll probably end up with a better solution. Another method used is to determine the total force mix of each nationality and base your forces from this. This is from a Garde du Corps, which incidentally is a free set of rules. Here the rules designers have listed all troop types and created 5 columns, one for each of the major periods. The values shown here were initially rather confusing, at least to me. So to assist in understanding the values, let's look at the German line infantry before 1805. There are 30 or more German line units, which consist of 18 figures each. The scale of this rules is 50 men for each figure, or 150, or 1 in 50. So the units represent a total of 900 men, which must represent a battalion. It is unclear if my assumption is correct, but 900 seems far too low for a regiment in 1800, although at Marengo some regiments approached this strength after fighting for several months. The next value, which is 5D, represents skill, which is 5, and morale, which is D. Skill ranges from 1 to 10, so 5 is about the middle, so it could be regarded as ordinary or trained. Morale ranges from A to G, so D is, again, at the centre of the range, so is probably has an ordinary morale, or, once again, trained. I find this chart useful as a list of troops, as it allows me to guess the changes between periods, but is not very useful as an army list, as an army list needs to also provide proportions as well as the total number of actual troops. If we compare these two columns, we can see the ratios remain reasonably consistent, but in 1815 are exactly about the same. The issue with this is the Hungarian formations normally stayed in Hungary or close by, so unless you are fighting the Ottomans, you would normally not have them included in your army list, or at least not to this level or total number. However, it's not all bad news. This comparison is far more useful, showing the rapid rise of Landwehr, which is not like Prussian Landwehr, being close to a border or home army, which was designed to protect a part of the country but was in other respects kind of regular army. The equipment, training skill and troop quality was lower, so could be regarded as low quality line infantry, let's say inferior. But all this looking for interesting patterns requires a great deal of knowledge of the subject, which as a new gamer I'm assuming may not be the case. As a result, I'll only recommend this type of analysis once you really get to know the history of your force mix that you have selected. As I have spent an enormous amount of time studying the Austrian army and think I understand the numbers reasonably well, I have conducted an analysis of the data in order to allow me to create an army list by period. A typical WRG force mix is 72 infantry elements. This represents 18 units of 4 elements, which is the midpoint between 12 units and 24 units. This totals 72 infantry elements, which is a bit large as a force mix, but for our exercise is what I'll use. I tried other values, but I found this value the best for this analysis. I then totaled all the infantry bases in the Garde du Corps army list and divided by 72, which gives me the value of, or a value of about 6 to 8, depending on the period. This represents the number of WRG-sized corps the Austrians possessed during one of the periods shown here. I now divided all the Garde du Corps values by 6 to 8, depending on the period, which gives me a WRG-compatible army list value. This is the result of all this calculation. Looking at the 1794 to 1804 column, we see our force mix now allows us to have 22 elements of German line infantry. If we go down to dragoons, we get 6 elements. The WRG list provides greater variability, which is specifically 12 to 24 elements for trained line infantry. So the values shown here would need to range from minus 1/3 to plus 1/3. Thus our dragoon value of 6 would range from, let's say, 4 to 8 elements. The lower value is only important if we want minimal value, which would not apply to the cavalry, but would certainly apply to the main infantry selections that you wish to make. This is an example, or as an example, the infantry would range from between 14 and 36 elements, which is a bit higher than the WRG 12 to 24 elements. However, if we go to 1809, the range becomes 12 to 24, which is amazingly close, and my guess, the WRG Army List is designed to provide you with, let's say, an 1809 force mix, which does make kind of sense. The artillery values seem rather high, as WRG would normally allow you to field a maximum of 24 artillery elements, assuming you are fielding the maximum number of infantry. The 6-pounder value is correct, as 14 is not far off the maximum of 12, but the 3-pounder is a big issue. My solution was to divide the 3-pounder battalion guns by 2. It's not perfect, but what I'm looking at here is trends, not a perfect number. But as indicated before, this is something you do once you have your force mix together and have a lot of knowledge in the subject. It does not assist you when you start out in building up your force mix. Last thing you want to do is purchase 23 elements of 3-pounders to only find no reasonable army list allows you to field that number of 3-pounders. The final method of obtaining some form of army list which you could use to build your force mix up is to pick a battle and use that force mix. This is a possible example using a figure scale of 1 in 250, that's 250 men per figure, and a 1 in 16 for artillery, or 16 artillery guns per artillery figure. If you convert the actual TO&E of that particular battle to elements, this shows you the Austrian force mix. This is probably a good force mix for a game, and if you have a point system, you can adjust this to meet specific points targets, if so desired. The only issue with this is the force mix you select may not be suitable for a later period. It is also not a good way to start a force mix for that possible reason. Nevertheless, it could be something a player could consider. It's simple, it's easy. You do get something which makes sense, at least in this case, for 1800, which is the Battle of Marengo. So at least you're starting out with something that you can use and use all the figures. Perhaps when you move to 1812, it'll all be different, but you can adjust your force mix accordingly when you start expanding the battles that you fight. After all this discussion about army lists, you may be asking yourself, why am I so obsessed with army lists? If you're recreating historical conflict, there's no need for an army list. You just need to do some playtesting and creation of victory conditions to get you a game because you're using the historical TO&E. Army lists are useful when having a points-based game, which allows you to quickly set up a game. You don't need to research historical orders of battles and playtest. You simply count up your points, deploy your forces, and have your game. There are issues with points-based games. Unless your rules are element maneuver rules, such as DBN, equal sides meeting ends in basically a boring game. You need to have unequal forces to force something to occur, or at least victory points which force people to do stuff. One option you could consider is, say, one side is the attacker, fielding all their forces, and the other defender, which fields only a portion of their forces, with the remainder arriving at the halfway point, but a greater number in total. Defenders starts deploying on the playing area, attacker off the playing area, an objective on the attacker side, an objective on the defender side perhaps. If the attacker gets both before the reinforcements arrive, they win. If not, the first player to gain both wins. During the game, a force mix can be forced to retreat if casualties are high enough, etc. There are some ways of creating a ubiquitous scenario or ad hoc scenario which gives you these asymmetrical force mixes, which allows you to actually achieve something. So there's actually some movement on the playing area. There are many variations on the theme that I've just covered, but this forces the attacker to attack in order to at least get the minimal objectives before the midpoint and the chance of ending the game if the second objective is possibly taken, or if enough objectives are taken. The defender gets a chance to launch a limited counterattack to ensure one objective is safe and the possibility of taking the second objective and winning. Both sides get to attack and defend. This, of course, depends on the rules. WRG rules would have difficulty with this type of scenario. but many more fluid rules which allow for more movement would be able to accommodate this quite simply. After many years of experimentation, in the end I've adopted a card-based approach using the force mixes of a given historical battle. The points value vary by when the corps arrives, and the forces available use an actual TO&E as the army list. This shows the entire Austrian army in 1805 using a set of rules which uses a scale of 1,000 men per element for infantry. Some of the corps are from Italy, and I had to break up one of the corps into 3 parts, based loosely on what actually occurred during the campaign. I would not field all these figures, and would only field a maximum of 6 of these corps-size formations only, normally about 4, but between 4 and 6. This, in theory, gives me a maximum of 72 elements in total, and 48 on average, which is likely how many elements you'll need for any set of rules, unless they are skirmish rules. And so we come to an end of episode 36 of my figure gaming hobby series, in this case how to create an Austrian Napoleonic army. Unfortunately, I'm not giving you any really firm conclusions, because really this all does depend on player preferences and what you want to achieve in a game. In my case, this video was created about 4 years ago, and I've changed my mind on the way to create army lists many times. I'm actually in the process of basing up a new Austrian army using US basing, and the system that I use is basically based on this card-based system and some universal or ubiquitous corps, which is a DBN system. And personally, I find it works reasonably well to allow me to create exactly what I need. I don't want to over-purchase or under-purchase figures, or at least minimize that to as much as possible. And I think I've got a kind of formula. But is it perfect? No way in the world. So in conclusion, every player will have to make up their own mind. I'm hoping this gives them some basic ideas that allow them to work out how to create their initial force mix. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.